So I have such a treat on the podcast today. My dear friend, Caroline Crawford, is an old camp friend of mine. We went to and worked at the same camp in North Carolina growing up and through college. And she is a dynamic personality and has now transformed into this public speaker. And it's so funny to come from the college days where you don't really know what you're going to do with your life to now we are full-blown adults, and to see her gifts come alive being a speaker and a consultant for these big companies that I'm going to tell you about is really cool. It just makes me so proud to be her friend. So I am going to welcome Caroline Crawford onto High School Counseling Conversations today, because you'll see from her background with licensed social work and just her clinical side, it really transfers into business cultures. And I think it comes a lot full circle over to us in school counseling and high school counseling specifically. She's got a lot of good things to say. And so let me introduce you to Caroline. She's a coach and a clinician. And as a coach, she understands the necessity of aligning needs, strengths, and values to fulfill true professional and personal potential. Now, I know you're like, yes, I want to feel that professional potential and that personal potential. You're going to hear that come through in our conversation. And so here's kind of her background. Caroline has worked in the people field for over a decade, and we're working in the people field too, right? From camp director to managing 200 counselors to the chief program officer of a nonprofit in charge of over 6,000 people, Caroline knows the importance of creating a culture based on emotional intelligence and psychological safety. You'll hear her talk about that in our conversation. She's learned to wear many hats and how to put out fires. She knows how to inspire teams and influence those around her. She knows how to unlock potential and empower others to use their voice. She sees the need to understand oneself first before positively leading others, and she's aware that all of this takes work. So here's her background. Caroline began her journey with her graduate degree from the University of Texas for clinical social work. After that, she knew she wanted to learn more, so she continued her journey with different courses like Yale University's Fostering Inclusion and Diversity and the Society of Emotional Intelligence's EQI 2.0 and EQ 360 course. So Caroline is a continued learner, and she brings a lot of research and knowledge and experience to our conversation today. I know you're going to love hearing from Caroline, and I'm just going to say this before we get started. It's really weird for me to call her Caroline because our camp names, just names that just stick with you. She was always Craw to me, just a shortened version of her last name. So this is my conversation with Craw. She would always call me by my maiden last name. And so this was a different experience, calling each other professionally by our first names. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. It is so good, and I can't wait to hear what you take away from it. You got into this profession to make a difference in your students' lives, but you're spread thin by all of the things that keep getting added to your to-do list. I can't create more hours in the day, but I can invite you into my Counselor Click, where you'll finally catch your breath. Come with me as we unpack creative ideas and effective strategies that'll help you be the counselor who leaves a lifelong impact on your students. I'm Lauren Tingle, your high school counseling hype girl, here to help you energize your school counseling program and remind you of how much you love your job. Hey, Caroline, I am so excited to have you on the podcast. I think that you're going to offer so much to these high school counselors who are listening with your background in social work and then the work that you're doing with bigger company cultures. I just know that you're going to bring a lot to the table today to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, like you said, my background is an LMSW, so licensed master social worker, and then a certified positive psychology coach. I worked in the nonprofit space, in the camp world, been empowering youth for over a decade, and then moved into working with adults just in the past few years.
Okay, so you worked with younger people, older people. Do you have a preference, or you're like, okay, no, these older people act like young high schoolers, so you have the best of all worlds?
Well, that's exactly what happened. I was chief program officer of a nonprofit called Girls Empowerment Network in Austin, Texas. And I was creating curriculum. I was actually working with school counselors every day, coming in and doing groups with them. And what I realized was all of these companies that were giving us grants, that were giving us money as a nonprofit, were saying, wait, we kind of want you to come and do something for our employees. And so I would take the curriculum I was creating for these young women ages 8 to 18 and doing it with adults and their ERGs for their company retreats. And I was realizing, oh, growth mindset, self-compassion, just the idea of like leadership and clear communication and boundaries and accountability and these things I was teaching the girls. It's like these adults don't have them. And so how am I going to send these girls into the working room world of like the adults who are supposed to be there, who are supposed to be their bosses or their managers aren't doing them and aren't socially role modeling that to them. So then I started my own business to work with adults.
I love that. And so you're seeing the same things from like younger people to older people, that we all need help with the same things. And then you had some experience working in schools and then like the business world. I would love to hear, just when I brought you on the show, I was thinking those culture things probably are the same in schools and in workplaces. Like when we're talking about healthy work cultures or toxic work cultures, what kind of like trends are you seeing there? And I don't know, I'm just thinking, you tell us about like the corporate world, and then we can kind of switch over to school world and see how they align.
Yeah, I actually really believe it's all the same hat. Everyone's like, oh, I wear this hat in this professional space, or I wear this hat because I'm in this professional space. And I'm like, it's all the same hat. Google did research probably about a decade ago now, where they were looking at the most successful teams, like what makes a team successful. And what they found was it was psychological safety. They thought it might be communication or money or power or whatever, but they found it was psychological safety, which is the ability to say, I don't know. It's the ability to say no. It's the ability to say help. It's the ability to say something that is real. And what we know to be true is whether we're in the schools or in corporate space, if we can go into our boss, we can go in with a colleague and say, hey, this is what's going on. And I feel supported. I feel connected. I feel authentic. I stay motivated. If I go in and say, hey, this is what's going on, and they say, deal with it or figure it out, or I don't believe you, well, then we feel unmotivated, right? And so any group that I work with, I always start with that foundational piece of psychological safety. But the only way we can create that in our spaces or in our culture is we got to first look in the mirror. We got to first say, wait, what's the story I'm telling myself? What is that inner critic? What's that imposter that's coming up that's stopping me from saying no, because I don't want to look like a fool, or stopping me from saying, no, I don't agree with you because I don't want to look like the bad guy, right? It stops us. And so then we're not creating psychological safety. So we have to start with ourselves.
And I think of the principals that I've worked for who have mirrored that really well. And exactly what you said, like I felt really safe by that. So like when something did come up, I could go to them and share how I was really feeling. If I was shut down one time, or I could tell they weren't being authentic in how they were leading people, I was like, I'm not going to you when I feel bad or I need some help somewhere along the way. Like, you don't know me.
Yes.
I never put language to that until when I had like a great principal, and then I had a harder to work for principal. I never made that connection that is what it was until I had left the school. That psychological safety and that landing pad that leadership gave me to make mistakes, to say, hey, what about this idea? Just like that open communication. It's a good thing. It's like, just because you're a leader doesn't mean you have to be this like authoritarian, totalitarian, like all this power in, like, that's not what leads people well.
No. And we also get like so wrapped up in it, right? Because if we want to look a certain way, if that little voice in our head is saying, hey, don't look like a fool, don't look like a fraud, well, then we want to look a certain way. And so even that principal, right, is saying, oh, wait, I'm the leader of the school, so I need to say I have the answers. Or really what we see over and over again in the research is leaders who say, I don't know, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I do have a good idea, but I want to know what your ideas are too.
Yeah.
Right? That it opens up a space. And it's not even flowery BS. It's actually biological. So I'm a nerd for neuroscience, and our mirror neurons in our brain are constantly searching for that connection. And so beyond, there's all the people who, especially in the corporate space, they're like, I don't need help. I don't need that connection. I just get stuff done. I don't need you to validate me. I don't need compliments. I don't need awards, blah, 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 blah.
We all know those people. Yep.
Exactly. But it's actually biological. We do need it. Our mirror neurons go off. We need to feel that connection. We need to feel that safety to stay motivated.
Totally. And I know you're like me. I don't usually go into a space thinking like, I'm going to look dumb. I'm like, I'm not worried about it. I'm like, I probably will look dumb and like we'll handle it and we'll get through it. But my husband is one of those who has that inner critic in his head who is like, don't say the wrong thing. You're going to look dumb. You're going to say something that people are going to remember forever. And I have had to tell him, like, I don't think it affects his leadership really, but I mean, it would make him more timid to, take a stance on something or go to somebody above him. He really needs that person above him to say, like, it's okay for you to make a mistake. Like, come in here and share your ideas. And he's a smart and very capable person in the workplace, but he's a great example of someone who like needs that permission to fail or permission to see somebody else fail in front of him.
Right. And it can be a double-edged sword, right? Because I constantly am working with my clients saying, lead from where you stand, right? Lead from where you stand. So if you want to be someone who has accountability, how do you show that to your peers? You want to be someone who has compassion, how do you show that to your peers? But I also took a course with Yale on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the first things they talked about was if you're not having inclusive leaders, if they're not socially role modeling how to create those spaces, at a certain point, you will hit that burnout because you can't keep leading from where you stand if you don't feel that acceptance or that continuation or that flow of what you're doing.
Yeah. Can you think of some practical examples of that, like leading from inclusion? Like, say someone is the department head of maybe like they're over 5 counselors, or they want to envision what it would look like to work in a school with a principal or an administrator who is this inclusive leader. What would that look like in a school? How do they know they're in a healthy place?
Yeah. So one thing that I think about often is we do this so well when we work with students. So we go in, let's say we're leading a group, after school group, or maybe it's a grief group or a group that is for the LGBTQ students or whatever it might be, right? Like we're creating this group. So then when the group comes in, we know as counselors, right, that we're going to first create group norms. We are going to say that. We're going to say, don't yuck my yum, or hey, how do we show up and listen? Or what does respect look like? How do we define what we want this group to be? Right. And yet, as adults, we don't do that. We just have all these assumptions and expectations. And so then we end up becoming disappointed or frustrated. And so one of the things I look for when I look for healthy teams and healthy peer groups or colleagues is, do they already have their norms? And what are they? And as much as sometimes it feels a little silly to be like, I want to create this, or I want to get a poster board and write these down, it was one of the healthiest work environments I've ever been in. Is we really created this space of things as simple as just like, how do we write back on emails? Like, are we a K period group? Or do we write out okay, thanks, and our name when we're responding to a Slack or email? And how big of a difference that makes. This group, we went as far as to say we don't talk about our bodies at work. I mean, that type of inclusivity to just say, it's just not something we're going to do here. And at first, I remember being like, oh, that feels really strict. I'm like, am I going to be able to do that? And all of a sudden, it just became this sense of ease where we talked about each other's confidence. We talked about each other's growth. We were able to get feedback in a different way, but we started taking out things that we were just like, if we don't want our girls or we don't want the people we're working with to be perpetuating this, then we cannot perpetuate that.
Totally. And I think counselors don't give themselves enough credit that they're doing this work already with students, and then they forget to do it with their own team of people. So when you have a department meeting, to have the structure and the outlines of the norms, like, we're not going to be on our phones during this meeting because we want to look at each other in the eyes. We want to get through our meeting because we all don't want to sit here all day. But we have to say that every time. I know, like, I am a big culprit of that too. Like, I'm going to pick up my phone and see who's texting me. But to be able to make sure that we communicate clearly and get through this meeting, we're not going to do that. But you would do the same thing with a student. If you were talking one-on-one with a student, you wouldn't be picking up your phone and checking your text messages.
And it makes me think a lot about self-efficacy, which is just the idea of the belief in self. Okay. So one thing that's really cool about self-efficacy is if you can do it in one domain, it's actually transferable to another domain. As big as, let's say, I'm not a good cook. I'm terrible cooking. But I'm like, I've decided I want to make a souffle. And I practice and I practice and I finally make the souffle. And I'm like, hell yes, look at my delicious souffle. I did it. Right. And then let's say I go on vacation and decide I want to take a surf class, and I've never surfed. I'm not a great surfer. My brain, because of that souffle, because I did it well somewhere else, I actually will be better at surfing. And I think that a lot about our schools and our counselors is, I'm like, you have such incredible skill sets. in accountability and communication and conflict resolution, in listening, active listening, and sitting with people in their pain and grief. And it's like, how do we take what we already are doing every single day with our students and give that same expectation to the teams that we work with?
Totally. It's so good to remember because, like you said, they have those skills. Now we just need to transfer it to enjoy our workplace.
But it is the inner critic, right? Because Lauren, if we're sitting in a group and I pick up my phone and I start texting, well, your first reaction is like, oh, that's annoying, Carol. Stop texting. I'm trying to give you, the agenda of the meeting. And then the next thing we think is, oh, don't be that person. Don't tell them to put down their phone. Or if I am going to be that person, they're going to think I'm mean, or they're going to think I'm annoying, or they're going to think I'm not chill or cool.
We can go through the whole rabbit trail of like why we didn't even speak up or say anything about it.
Exactly. And so if you create those norms at the beginning and just every time say, who's going to read them out loud this meeting?
Mm-hmm.
We don't do cell phones. Well, then now you have this anchor place where every single person in the group, not just the leader, but every single person in the group should hold that person who picked up their phone account.
Yes. And that works with students. Like you see it, it feels silly every time. Like we're going to go through these again this week, but but it works. It's like we know in group counseling settings that works. So okay, you touched a little bit on, how we are handling things with students like grief and trauma. And those are like really heavy things. I would say some of my hardest days as a high school counselor were those really tough emotional days, like with a student death. And that's what you're doing all day. So talk about like that territory that comes with the heavy emotions and the burdens of being a high school counselor, just like bearing other people's stuff every day. How do high school counselors have like self-compassion for that? Like, how do we take care of ourselves? And maybe talk about how it's related to burnout. Maybe you're going to tell me like that's not the stuff that leads to burnout and it's more cultural stuff in the workplace. But like, how do we care for ourselves and keep going when it's really hard?
Yeah. One of my mantras, and I start almost all my workshops and I tell this to all my clients, is experiences are different, but emotions are the same. And so often we sit in a place where we're like, oh, we didn't have the death of a parent, but we're going to be the ones sitting in this pain and grief and this trauma, right? And here's the thing. We still feel that pain and grief and trauma. Like we still feel it, and it's still so heavy. And so first and foremost, it's allowing yourself to feel it. It's not saying, oh, I need to be above this, or I need to always have this perfect separation, or I need to be able, because this is my job, I know exactly where to put it on what shelf. And when I go home, I can turn it off and turn it back on. No, we're humans. We are complex. And when those emotions come up, they come up. And so sometimes, and you know this, right? Like sometimes you're sitting with a student who's going through something really hard and you can just be right there with them. And somehow they walk out of your office and you're like, and you can just keep going. And sometimes they walk out of your office and you just need to weep.
And you weep.
Or you need to scream, or you need to throw something. Like it's hard. And so I think first and foremost, always just allow yourself to feel your feelings. One of the things that we do that causes really unnecessary suffering is the shame that we feel about what we should be feeling or how we should be. And I think especially as professionals, there are so many days where I'm like, hey, I have back-to-back clients. Maybe my very first client is going through a horrible divorce or had a death or something going on. And I'm like, oh, I should be able to turn that off and turn on for my next client. But that's just not the truth. And so then all of a sudden I get this shame of this should, right? And instead, first feel your feelings. That's what I would always say. And allow yourself the space. Now, I also have worked in schools and I know for a fact not every day you get the space. Not every day you can have that turnover. And so what is the next thing? And I think about Emily and Amelia Nagasaki's book, Burnout. I don't know if you've read it or not.
I have not.
Oh, okay. Let me
I got to add it to the show notes. I got to add it to my Goodreads list.
Yes, it is so good. But they talk a lot about burnout, especially in women. And what does that burnout feel like? How do we hold it in our body? And especially as Americans who have these values of efficiency and productivity and go, 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 that we're actually all walking around with compounded burnout. So compounded stress. So we go to school and we have all this stress, and then we go home and we have laundry or families, or we got to cook or whatever. And then we don't actually do what I call capital R rest. We actually do lowercase r rest. We turn on the Netflix or we read a book and we just turn off or numb.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many days where I'm like, I just need to numb out. Like I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to think about anything else. And so then we wake up the next day and all that compounded stress from the day before is still right back with us. And so one thing I really ascribe to, and what Amelia Nagasaki talk about in their book, is these 7 pillars of ending the stress cycle, of saying, okay, we're in the stress cycle, we open it up. The adrenaline, the cortisol, even if it's not our stress, even if we're taking on someone else's, like our students' stress, that adrenaline, that cortisol, that's all been still released in our bodies.
Yes, it transfers over to us.
I know, right? And then we're just sitting there like, oh.
And if you don't stop to think about it, you're like, why do I feel this way? No, it was someone else's. That just because of our role, we take that on.
Yeah, exactly. You feel it in your heart, you feel it in your shoulders, you feel it in your gut. And so they have these simple ways, and it does feel almost like ridiculous because you're like, oh, really? Me laughing out loud is going to do this? But what they found in the research is there's these 7 different ways, like going for a walk, laughing out loud, having a deep, meaningful conversation. We love our DNCs. Are these ways that we do capital R rest. And so we're actually processing and closing the stress circle. And we need to be practicing doing that every single day. And it's hard, right? Like, it's kind of like when I tell clients, like, do you want to journal? And they're like, oh, yeah, I'll journal. I mean, literally no one ever journals, right? But it's how do we start to practice those things so that we know the next morning we wake up, if we've had a hard day, that we're doing that capital R rest and making a moment to reconnect with ourselves and our values and kind of our North Star.
Do you ever make these like big corporate people stop in the middle of your workshops and like laugh out loud because you know it's going to relax them, connect them to somebody else, and like be a silly moment? I think that there's so much value in that.
Yes, absolutely. So I often say I'm a corporate camp counselor.
That's a perfect description of you.
I just feel like, for a long time, I had that same inner critic of just like, I'm supposed to be a professional. And so I'm supposed to look and act a certain way. And what I realized is, no, like I value vulnerability and I'm very serious about what I do and care deeply about mental health and growing leaders. And I'm silly as hell and I want to dance and I'm going to do voices and I'm going to make people get a little uncomfy and it's going to be really fun. Can I tell you a story about this?
Please.
Okay. So I'm in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm with about 200 people. Most of them are very large men who work in the field. And for those of you who are listening, I'm about 5'3", a little blonde, bubbly, just like, and they're like, no, they were just not having it. From the very beginning, you could tell.
They're like, who is this girl? Why is she here to talk to us?
Yes, truly. So I pull up my first slide and it's about psychological safety. And this man raises his hand. He has this handlebar mustache and he's in a motorcycle cut and he's got these big old muscles. And he just looks at me and he says, Caroline, I don't give a damn about your psychobabble bullshit. And I was standing with my slide, just like me shaking, like, oh,
so
okay.
That's the direction this is going to go.
Here we go. And I'm only telling you all this because I know that all of you have had that one student who's like, Miss, I don't care what you say. Miss, I don't want to be in this group. I'm madam in your office or whatever it might be, right? And so the next day, by the end of our session, I have them all circle up and I make all of these men stand in a circle and we're going to do a gratitude together. At this point, we're dancing over to the circle. Some of them are still rolling their eyes at me. And Gary raises his hand and says, I want to go first. And I was like, oh no.
This is the same guy.
Same guy.
Okay.
And he comes in the circle and he looks me up and down and I'm nervous. Like he kind of threw me off my game. He made me feel a certain way, right? Like this is what I care about. And he actively got a whole group of people to be like, we don't care. And then he said to me, Miss Caroline. I was like, oh, Miss. Okay, something here has changed. And he said, Miss Caroline, I just want to say thank you. I don't think I've ever learned more about myself than I have in these 2 days.
Oh.
And I think about that because I think, especially as counselors, when we go into these spaces, it feels cringe. It feels kind of ick when we're forcing ideas or trying to hold people accountable or pushing ourselves to really feel things and not just go through the motions. Sometimes we can be hard on ourselves or we can get cringe. There is that seed that we're planting.
Mm-hmm. Someone is listening.
And when I start to feel burnt out, when I start to feel that just exhaustion or that frustration, I try to go back to the idea of seeds because we don't always get to see the blossoms, right? Our kids
Mhm.
go. They go to the next grade, they go to the next school, they move on, and we don't always get to see the blossoms. But when we do have those moments, like Gary telling me that is such a blossom. And I know each one of your counselors who listen to this have one of those moments where you're just like, yes, how do we come back to that? Because that recenters us in that capital R rest and that sense of value of our why, not just the what of our job, right? We get strung down in the what. I have these meetings. I have these emails. I have this thing I have to do. I have this on Wednesday. I got to go here on Friday. But what's the why of our job? And how do we make a point every day to try to come back to that?
Yeah, and I don't think that we give enough value to calling that rest with a capital R. Like that does like rest our souls that, like this is work that we've been called to that we feel like is good and meaningful and valuable work. But when we don't stop and reflect on maybe something that was hard that turned good, or that student who literally said, I'm not talking to you, or like they sent me down here and I have nothing to say. And then you think of the breakthroughs that you had or the self-reflection that now they're able to vocalize, like that's huge.
Mm-hmm. In positive psychology, Martin Seligman writes a book called Flourish, and it's a great book. And it's really about how do we retrain our brain because we have a negative propensity. We look for risk first. It makes sense. We're running from a saber-toothed tiger, right? Like everything is a problem. We have to save ourselves.
Everything's on fire all the time.
But it doesn't actually make sense in our society anymore. I mean, that would be a whole nother podcast because yes, everything is on fire. However, most days we're not actually running from a saber-toothed tiger. It's not actually the energy that we need is to go to that problem. And so how do we actively tell ourselves stories of success, tell ourselves stories of joy, tell ourselves stories of us doing the right thing, right? People often ask, oh, Carolyn, do you get really nervous before you do public speaking? And I'm like, actually, I really don't anymore. And they're like, why not? And I said, I actually see myself. I can see myself at the end of the talk saying thank you and giving out high fives and seeing people laugh and people come up to me and giving out hugs. And I can see it so clearly. And so I now tell myself the story of not where I'm going to trip over my words, not where I'm going to look like a fool, not where like, I get too nervous and I say the wrong thing, but I tell myself a story of success. And often in our everyday life, we tell ourselves the stories of the risk or the problems.
The Click Collaborative is a membership for high school counselors designed to equip, encourage, and connect counselors to their greater community. With a professional development-driven mindset, the membership hub comes loaded with 25-plus instantly accessible PD videos, completion certificates, and bonus features like templates, checklists, and counseling resources. But the best part isn't the features. It's the changes you'll see in your confidence and your counseling program. Inside, you'll find worthwhile, practical, and applicable PD that propels you to action and a community full of your people where you can grow, connect, and feel validated. Does this sound like the support you've been looking for? If so, I want to invite you to check out the Click Collaborative at clickcollab.com. That kind of carries into kind of the last thing I want to touch on is imposter syndrome. So I would say definitely new high school counselors are feeling this. Like they're maybe coming from just doing an internship, or maybe they're coming from elementary or middle and they're just now moving into high school and everything feels unknown and high stakes and very scary. Like, am I in the right place? I can't believe someone hired me for this job. But also like veterans who have been here for a long time, like you're always asking questions. Every scenario feels gray. Like, am I doing the right thing? So is the solution to imposter syndrome going through that story in our head over and over and visualizing us finding success? Like, what strategies do we need to be using to combat that imposter syndrome?
Yeah. Dr. Kristen Neff, who is a leading researcher on self-compassion, she has 3 tenets of really combating this. And the very first one is be kind to yourself, which feels so like silly and easy. And also maybe eye-rolly, like, oh, okay, mom, like be kind to myself. But I think it is like the most important tenet. And it's one that we're not very self-aware of. So let's just say this, like I'm walking down the street, bop, bop, bop. I see all these people, I wave, and then I trip and I fall on my face, right? Well, the first thing I think is, oh my God, you blundering fool. You're such an idiot. You're such a dum-dum. They all saw you pop up. Oh, No, nobody looked at me. Oh, they're all looking. Okay, now I just got to walk away. Or do I try to make a joke? Oh, that joke didn't land. Okay, now I'm even more of a fool, right? Like you're just like, ugh,
Spiraling. Yeah.
right? Or could we say to ourselves, if we were going to be kind to ourselves, like I trip and I fall and I jump up and I'm just like, that's showbiz, baby, right? Like that's just here I am. Like I'm human. I am so complicated and so just like going to fail. Like I'm going to fail. And so
I think of how much permission that would then give me, even as the person walking by on the sidewalk, to be like, what would I have done in that situation? And it gives me some confidence too that like, hey, that's okay.
exactly. And when I think about being kind to yourself, I often try to think about your best friend, right? So what would you say to your best friend if she just moved from middle school to high school counseling and was like, I don't know what I'm doing? Well, your best friend one would probably give you a hug or some type of physical touch, a high five. They would be there for you. They might buy you a treat. They might say, let's go get ice cream. Let's go have a beer or whatever it might be. And then they're probably going to say, you are incredible. Like, let me tell you all the reasons why you're incredible. Let me tell you about all the things that you did at the last middle school you were at, or let me tell you about how well you did in grad school, or let me tell you about how many people that you've touched and affected and made these ripples. And then you walk out of that conversation with your best friend being like, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, ba-da,
I can do this.
right? And yet we can actually do that for ourselves. That's where that first line of self-compassion comes in is how do we remind ourselves to talk the way our best friend would share with us?
Mm-hmm.
Because we wouldn't have any friends if you fell, Lauren, and I go, you blundering fool.
We would not be friends and I would not take your advice.
And yet we do it to ourselves every day. And I'm like, why? Why do we do that? Right. And then the other thing Kristen Neff talks quite a bit about is just recognizing shared humanity and holding negative self-talk in a mindful awareness. So recognizing shared humanity is really, I like to think about it as like dancing in traffic in Austin, Texas. Have I-35. It is awful. And I would get off of work and I would just get so angry. Like the Incredible Hulk would be coming out of me. I'd be like, I can't do this. I'm so mad. I don't want to be sitting in traffic. I just want to be home. I want to be on the couch. I've had a hard day. Why am I here? Right. And I could feel myself getting angry. And then somebody might cut in front of me. And now all of a sudden I'm like yelling explicitly, like all that, again, that adrenaline and cortisol is getting released. And one day I was sitting on 35 and I was starting to get mad and I could feel the Hulk trying to peek out. And I was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm just not going to do this. And I started making really awkward eye contact with the car next to me. And I did the like dirty dancing thumbs up, like, hey. And he kind of looked me up and down like, no, lady, I'm not going to do that.
Are you by yourself? You're in the
I am
car.
alone in my car. I am alone in my car. And so then I kind of started doing the disco finger. I'm like doing, the Superman. I'm like trying to do all these moves. And finally they start laughing and they start doing a move back. And in that moment, I started laughing and I realized, wait, I had control to release oxytocin, serotonin, all the good feelings by just making a choice in that moment. And so I moved to the next car and I did it again. Now that car flipped me off and we're like, no, I'm not going to do this with you. And I was like, got it. But even that in itself made me start to laugh, right? Like, I was, you're mad about traffic. I get it. And then finally, I remember on this specific day, I got to an 18-wheeler and I did the honk sign.
Of course.
We are in bumper to bumper traffic in downtown Austin. And the trucker looked at me and just nodded and laid on the horn. And I was screaming and he was screaming. And it was
and like, when was the last time an adult did that to him? Like the 5-year-old in the car driving by did it. But he's like, oh, now we're adults sharing this experience and this is funny.
Exactly. And so I was recognizing our shared humanity. We're all in traffic. We are all anchored. We are all frustrated. Like we all just want to be home. And maybe I get to go home and sit on my couch, but maybe someone in that traffic is going to their second job.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe someone's going home to take care of a sick parent. Maybe someone is having to figure out what they're going to put on the table that night for dinner in a way that I don't even have to.
But in this moment, like we get to choose happiness or joy or, whatever that is that you want to choose for yourself.
And you get to recognize that we're all in this together. Often the inner critic or that imposter starts to make us feel like we're alone on the island. We're the only one who feels this way. We're the only one who's going to look like a fool.
We're the only one who's ever done this job for the first time. No.
Exactly.
Everyone has done this for the first time at some point.
So often when my inner critic starts to come up, when I have clients who have that, I really remind them, hey, think about dancing in traffic. And then that last one is holding negative talk in a mindful awareness. And I think about Sesame Street, where the words go along on the screen.
Like a sing along. Yeah.
Yes. And then the words just disappear, right? And then the next lyrics come up. Well, often we have the choice. So let's say it comes up. I think, oh my gosh, you look like a fool. Well, I could either go down what I call my negative death spiral of you look like a fool. You're an idiot. You shouldn't be in this job. Everyone knows you shouldn't be in this job. Why are you even here? You are worthless. And I get to this place of you are worthless. You are not worthy. Right. Or like the Sesame Street lyrics, we can say, hey, you look like a fool, or you're an idiot, or you whatever that negative talk is. And then I can just hold it for a second and say, do I want to make meaning out of this?
Nope.
And it's mental gymnastics. It takes a lot of work, but then I can just let it go flying off the screen like those songs and say, I don't actually have to make meaning out of this. That was a cruel thought. A best friend would not say that to me. What would a best friend say? And so it's taking pause and it's taking an audit of how you're talking to yourself. So that first one was be kind to yourself. The second one was recognize shared humanity or dancing in traffic. And then that last one is holding negative talk in mindful awareness or really just being on Sesame Street.
Those are perfect examples to remember each of those too. And I'm sure that all of that takes practice. Like you don't overcome that imposter syndrome overnight. You don't show up and work in this healthy work environment without that shared vulnerability and shared humanity with the other adults that you're working with. Like all of this takes practice and you to go first. Like, I mean, that's vulnerability is you going first and saying, this is hard. I feel however you feel, being honest about that. And I think that can go so far.
And is life happening at you or are you creating your own life? And what I mean by that is often I see this in a lot of companies. I've seen this at schools where it's like, well, the principal's X way or the culture is X way. And so I just have to sit there and kind of take it. And I'm like, nope. You actually can go out and say, I'm going to have a conversation with the principal about what I'm noticing and how I feel. Or I'm going to go talk to that colleague and say, hey, I don't think your boundaries are great. Now, is that cringy, icky, scary conversation?
Right. Can it be awkward? Probably.
Oh, it will be.
Yeah.
Why don't we just absolutely say this is going to be awkward? But here I go, because I actually want to say I have power. I have the ability to make shifts and changes. And then I think the last piece of burnout that I always want to speak to is that you are never truly stuck. I know that it can feel that way. And I know that it can feel sometimes like, well, what if I have had, like, I'm thinking about a listener right now being like, well, I have had this conversation with the principal and I have had to tried to make a difference. And I've tried to change the culture. I've tried and nothing has shifted. Well, at what point then do you have to really take the audit of, is this the right place for me? Is there another school that might be more open to this? Is there a role that I could be more empowered, that I could use my voice, that I could give my gifts to the world and not feel silenced by it?
Yeah, I think that's so important because that's the reality. There are some places where like the other people aren't going to get better and you've done all the work that you can do to change your immediate culture, and some other people you can't change. You can change you, but there might be a time where it's time to get out, to go either do something else if you are feeling like you have nothing else to offer, or find a different school. Because I tell people all the time, like there are good schools out there, there are good leaders out there to work for. You got to find the one that's the good fit for you.
Yeah. And I think most of my social work and counselor friends, they're such fix-it firefighters. Like they see the fire and they're like, I'm going to go in and fix this. I'm going to make it right. And it is one of the noblest and most wonderful qualities in people when they can say, I really want to make this place better. And then also, how do you constantly put your own oxygen mask on first to say, is this my job right now to make this better? Have I already done all the things in my tool belt and I am now just exhausting myself? And when do I know when to walk away or when to say, this is not my job to fix?
Yeah.
This is my realm and this is what I can give and do. But it is not my job to constantly be running at every fire and making it right, because I've got to take care of me so then I can take care of those kiddos.
Totally. And that takes a lot of self-awareness and reflection too. So it's a process to be aware of yourself and where you are in that space in your workplace. And then it also takes self-awareness and confidence and humility to like take the next step if you need to go do something else. So I give props to people doing both things, trying to fix the things, that they can and take the steps of empowerment that they need to have those conversations with people. And then also, like, it can be big and scary to leave that too.
That's right. I talk a lot about patterns. So recognizing patterns. And so if you're trying to be a disruptor, if you're trying to change a culture or change a team dynamic, the first time something happens, we always need to allow that just to be the first time it happens. The second time something happens, it's like, okay, I'm noticing something. The third time it happens, there's a pattern. At that point, that's when there needs to be some type of, let's get in there, let's talk about this, let's problem solve, let's fix. And then if it happens the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time, it might be that the pattern's not going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we feel okay with that? Can we feel okay with that? Or if we're not going to be okay with that, it may not be that we're the fix-it firefighter in this moment. We may not be able to change that pattern.
Exactly. Caroline, this was an awesome conversation. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you feel like high school counselors need to hear kind of from your world and things that you've seen in different work cultures and stuff?
Yeah, I think there's something really just one beautiful about doing high school counseling and counseling in general. Mental health is so necessary, and talking about it. Because as we go into, right, as those students move from elementary to middle, from middle to high, from high into maybe the working world, or maybe they're going to college, but they are going out, how do they have that skill set to then do the things that we're talking about? And so you are creating those ripples and really helping them learn that. I think about this a lot for myself when I was working in that nonprofit and I was going into schools every day and I'm teaching this curriculum on self-compassion, on the inner critic, on growth mindset, on these leadership skills, how much it was just sitting with me. And it was making me realize, okay, if I really want to teach someone how to do this, I have to do it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the thing I'd want these counselors to hear the most is like, you already are doing it for hundreds of students and for years. And so how do you keep doing it for yourself? How do you say, wait, everything that my student deserves, I deserve as well?
Totally. What a great little pep talk to end on. They're going to leave this, listening to this, feeling so empowered. Like, I can do this. I can keep going. Caroline just motivated me too.
Yes, I love it.
Well, Caroline, where can people connect with you? I'll link it all in the show notes. But like, if they want to like learn more about you, or I mean, do you ever go to schools or do like Zoom workshops or anything?
Do.
Okay,
Yeah.
Tell them about it.
I will come in and do your teacher work days. I've come into schools all over Texas. We'll do strengths or just do like some of that team bonding, some of the places of, I call them focus circles, but really they're just venting. It's that place to say, I need to talk about this. And now I need to also take action items. It's like, how do we really listen? How do we create that psychological safety together? So you can find me on LinkedIn. You can always just DM me. And then my website is CarolineCrawfordConsulting.com. And there's a contact sheet and I try to write back every day.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. I know everyone's going to love this conversation.
Thank you, Lauren.
I loved this conversation with Caroline about self-compassion and beating imposter syndrome and facilitating a really positive work culture and then realizing when you need to get out if it's not going to change. She had so many nuggets in here that I am going to take away, scribble down, and share with you all over and over again because I think this is an episode that you're going to listen to more than once. So thank you, Caroline, for being here. I've said it once, I'll say it again. She had so much good stuff to offer, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode of High School Counseling Conversations. All the links I talked about today can be found in the show notes and also at counselorclick.com/podcast. Be sure to hit follow wherever you listen to your podcast so that you never miss a new episode. Connect with me over on Instagram. Feel free to send me a DM at counselorclick. That's CLIQUE. I'll see you next week.